Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Xinhu Yu, the chair of RMIT Professorial Academy, the host of this event. First, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. I respectively acknowledge their elders, past and present. So today we shall hear from distinguished Professor Sara Charlesworth, a lecture entitled Aging Future Quality Care and Decent Work. So this is part of the activities hosted by the Academy in fulfilling its obligations and the ambassador, advocate, and thought leader for RMIT. So before we start, let's just go through some housekeeping matters. So this is a team live event. You will not be able to directly ask any questions via microphone. So please post your questions in the Q&A section during the lecture. At the end of it, I will pick up those popular ones and ask a presenter on your behalf. So let's just start the lecture by introducing the speaker. So distinguished Professor Sara Charlesworth researches on gender inequality in employment and its various manifestations, including in gender pay inequity, sex discrimination, gender-based violence, and the precarious and insecure work. So more recently, her research has focused on the aged care sector. So she has participated in key gender equality policy reviews and debates, and been invited to give evidence to a range of government inquiries, including to the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety. She has also been an advisor to diverse government and private sector organizations, as well as community and human rights bodies. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Sara to deliver her lecture. Over to you, Sara.
Many thanks, Singh. And I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Woiwurrung and Burrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands I'm currently located. And indeed, in thinking about better ageing futures, we can learn a lot about the recognition of many older adults by First Nations peoples as elders, as people to be held in esteem and as wisdom holders of the community, rather than a problem to be dealt with away from prying eyes. So the Royal Commission's emphasis on caring as a relationship goes to the heart of good quality care. So today I'm going to focus on current and future challenges in creating and sustaining caring relationships in aged care, or what is known as long-term care, and draw on recent research to address two key challenges. They are of ageism and the gendered undervaluation of aged care recipients and workers, and ensuring that we have the necessary policy and regulatory architecture, as well as work conditions and work organisation to provide the conditions for quality care and decent work. I'll also talk briefly to the growing migrant aged care workforce in aged care. So I'm drawing here on two main projects. The Decent Work Good Care project is a cross-national study of 4 aged care systems, and as well as policy analysis and interviews across the 4 countries, I draw in particular on data gathered through a rapid ethnographic methodology. Our version of this methodology made use of between 2 to 4 insider researchers who had national expertise in the particular country, and 2 to 4 outsider researchers who had expertise in other countries' systems. We used this in organisational case studies conducted over an intensive period of up to a week on the ground, and gathered data from multiple sources, including through observations, shadowing workers, interviews, informal discussions, etc., with managers, workers and clients and residents. The Markets Migration and Care project, led by Emerita Professor Deborah Brennan, was essentially a multi-level policy and regulatory study of the ways in which migration, employment and care regimes intersect in Australia and New Zealand to shape in particular the migrant care worker experience. And today I draw on our analysis of migration regulation in the Australian context and analysis of available data sets. And really the central theme of these two projects has been exploring ways in which care quality in the formal aged care system can be undermined or indeed enhanced by the conditions in which frontline workers provide that care. So researchers interested in the impact of employment, care and migration regimes on the conditions of work and care have focused on the complex interplay of institutions, policies, regulation, national and global conditions and policy mechanisms that intersect in different ways in different national contexts. And as I will highlight later in the lecture, gendered norms about what constitutes skill in aged care are reflected in all three regimes. In Australia as elsewhere, COVID really revealed the fault lines in our aged care system. And across the board, it has revealed the lack of dignity and respect accorded both aged care service users and workers in planning for the pandemic. There was a lack of adequate equipment and infection control training, a lack of clarity about accountability of federal and state governments, the safety regulator and providers, and the price of increasingly fragmented and precarious work with the lack of or limited access to paid leave became very obvious in terms of the workforce. While the rate of COVID infections and the death toll of aged care residents was regularly reported on, in Australia there was really relatively little recognition of the impact of COVID on workers, except by the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety. As we see in this excerpt here. The Royal Commission undertook a special inquiry into the impact of COVID, and in that report, in the introduction, they actually draw attention to the impact or some of the direct impacts of COVID on aged care workers, which I think is very important. And once again, they underscore the importance of the close relationships that care workers develop with residents in this case, but it also applies to home care. In Australia, as you can see here in the circle, this is data actually on worker cases and deaths and from a number of countries. The number of COVID infections recorded for workers in residential aged care in fact slightly exceeded the number of COVID infections among residents, but you wouldn't know that from the media. However, luckily, unlike in particularly the US and the UK, in Australia, residential aged care workers didn't die of COVID contracted at work. However, despite the fact that there are many more older adults, and I'll come to this, using home care services, home care clients and home care workers have not only been absent from most discussions of COVID in aged care, but also in discussions of the future of the aged care workforce. So in this talk, I want to focus mainly on home care in an attempt to bring this vital and indeed growing sector of formal care into view. But well before the COVID pandemic started, the Royal Commission to Aged Care Quality and Safety recognised in its interim report the systemic substandard care in Australian aged care. And they note here key fundamental contributing factors to both the unacceptable quality of care provided and also underscore the role unacceptable conditions of work play in the poor quality of care we have in our system in Australia. At the Royal Commission, 85% of witnesses spoke about workforce issues, and I'm going to attempt to play you two very short excerpts, one from nursing home resident Mel Mitchell, who unfortunately died just a little while ago, and a worker, Catherine Nobes, who both talk about the impact of inadequate staffing on the quality of care.
I'd like to take this opportunity to revisit some of the evidence you've heard from a selection of our workforce witnesses so far. To do so, we asked the operator to play a video.
Staff don't have time to provide that sort of support for you. So if I need something in the middle of the night, because there's only one nurse responsible for 170 patients, I wait a very, very long time.
And I'm just going to take you to the worker here, if you could bear with me. This is Catherine Nobes.
In my opinion, there is insufficient staffing at the facility. We are told that everyone is an individual and has to be treated with respect. As care workers, we completely agree with this statement. However, we repeatedly find ourselves with such a heavy workload that we just have to manage a situation that we can't give the residents the time that we would like.
So these two excerpts really, I think, give a flavour of the lived experience of care recipients and workers in our system of aged care. And I think particularly the latter one underscores the disconnect between the rhetoric of person-centred care and the actual reality on the ground. So I want to step back now a little and provide some background to our formal aged care system, because in fact it plays a relatively small part in meeting the support needs of older adults. Most older people who require support with the activities of daily living have that support provided by family members, overwhelmingly female partners and daughters. And as you can see here, with population ageing and increasing longevity, as people age, there's a large and growing proportion who suffer at least one long-term health condition. This brings with it a complexity of needs for assistance with the activities of daily living as people age, especially personal activities, with the greatest need overall for assistance with healthcare and mobility. And particularly for those aged 85 and over, the need for assistance with self-care and cognitive and emotional tasks also rises sharply. So who uses long-term care in Australia? So in 2019-20, over 1 million people received support from formal aged care services, although some people used multiple programs more than once during the year. But as you can see here, many more people used home care than residential care. The Commonwealth Home Support Program is used by the most service users, and it's a program that's supposed to provide entry-level services and importantly is block funded. A smaller but growing number of people now use the Home Care Packages program, which has a consumer-directed model of individualised care, where a fixed amount of money per annum is provided for individuals for care and support on the basis of their assessed needs. Now, this program was roundly critiqued by the Royal Commission as it's highly rationed, inflexible and inadequate. There are 100,000 people still waiting for a package who'd been assessed and approved for one, and last year 16,000 people died while still waiting to be allocated services for which they've been approved. From the data here from the Aged Care Finance Authority, you can see the importance of the use of aged care services by women, and across the board, women make up 2 out of every 3 service users, and the use of services by women increases with age. This actually puts our use of long-term care in a cross-national perspective. And as I said, if we focus perhaps here on the figures I've highlighted, the most long-term care is used now by people 80 years and over. Institutional care is residential, what we know as residential care in Australia. But in most OECD countries, including the ones here, a greater proportion of aged care recipients use home care rather than institutional care. And as you can see, Australia's use of residential aged care for the 80+ population is higher. In other countries, the shift to home care is much more advanced. For example, in Sweden and New Zealand, as you can see there. In its final report, the Royal Commission set out what the community expects from aged care in Australia. But this is a long way from the reality of what the community actually gets. Government policy could be argued to be essentially based on a palliative model, And to put it crudely, it's about keeping people comfortable till they cark it. Aged care policy can be compared with the policy aims of early child education and care and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where at least the policy focus, if not the practice, is much more on supporting service users to realise their potential. There's no mention of that in Australian aged care policy. What the community also gets is the real lack of accountability, and this has been missing in action through successive federal governments and by providers, particularly in accounting for the funding spent on the provision of care, and there is really very little quality and safety oversight of the care that's delivered, particularly in home care, as the Royal Commission notes here. What results then is rationed, task-based, rushed and substandard care. So what underpins the parlous state of our aged care system? Ageism is an important norm, and this 2019 submission to the Royal Commission from a broad-based national coalition points to the important role of ageism, which attaches a lower value and greater stigma to older adults, particularly those with long-term health conditions or disability, and that's very much reflected in our systems of aged care. The ageist and gendered undervaluation of older service users, who, as I've already explained, are increasingly female as they age, and the gendered undervaluation of the work performed by the frontline aged care workers lie at the heart of our current system. So who works in aged care? Well, you'd have to say that the quality of available data on the aged care workforce is a national disgrace. And that's for two main reasons: the level of accurate detail available and the reliability of that available data. And the inadequacy of data really reflects the lack of attention historically given to this important and growing sector of the economy. In terms of Australian Bureau of Statistics data, there's a lack of adequate disaggregation of industry classifications, particularly in home care, and also the occupational classifications set out also use very poorly described descriptors. These classifications underpin available census data. This makes it very hard to accurately identify the key characteristics of home care workers, and in particular, the classification of home care workers as aged and disabled workers may well include disability support workers who work with clients in private homes also. The second set of data, the independently run 4-yearly National Aged Care Workforce Census and Survey data, and the last one was produced in 2016, have been used as probably the best source of data we have on the aged care workforce, but they were only run with directly employed workers, who are a slowly declining share of the frontline care workforce, both with the rise of care workers employed as self-employed, in labour hire, or indeed as gig workers. The so-called aged care workforce census that was run by the Department of Health in 2020 was run with providers only. They surveyed program by program, and they say themselves that their worker numbers are probably overestimates, as workers may be counted more than once, working across a number of different programs and sites. But what is clear from all the data sources is that the frontline aged care workforce is overwhelmingly female, and indeed an older group of workers with an average age of between 45 to 49. From the NAQUIS surveys, there is evidence of a declining ratio of workers to recipients at the very time the needs of the older adults who use the system have become more demanding and complex. The NAQUIS surveys also show that over time the skill mix in long-term care has declined. There's simply a much smaller proportion of nursing qualified staff in 2016 than there was in 2003. In Australia, there are no mandated staffing levels or skill mix, unlike in early childhood education and care. Our quality standards only require staffing numbers are adequate and skill levels are appropriate, and what that is left up to providers. with really very little oversight by the Quality and Safety Regulator, as both the Royal Commission and also Professor Gabriel Marr from Macquarie have noted. So what do home care workers do? Well, this ANSCO classification that you can see here really mischaracterises the nature of home care work. It's classified as ANSCO level 4, which in the ANSCO classification typology is low-skilled work. But in fact, home care workers provide a range of complex care and support by themselves in a client's home with no direct supervision. This requires high levels of responsibility and judgment. There are distinct areas of skill where workers exercise knowledge acquired in formal training and through experience to carry out care work with the frail-aged. It's very different working with clients who are unable to undertake certain care for themselves but able to make decisions about the care they need than with clients who are unable to make decisions about the care they need at all. And this is an important distinction that's made in the much better home care classification structures in Victorian local government home care services. Going to skills in home care, I draw here on a typology from Professor Lydia Hayes from Kent University, who identifies a series of types of skills. But if we look first at health or nursing related skills and knowledge of complex conditions, some examples in home care are those concerned with what were described in the former New South Wales Award, covering workers in the now defunct New South Wales Home Care Service, as bodily intrusion skills. These are assisting with bowel use, peg feeding, wound management, catheterisation, changing colostomy and drainage bags. Home care workers also need knowledge of how to manage client behaviours related to dementia or cognitive decline, and also provide sensitive end-of-life care. Bodywork skills require specialist knowledge and skill to enable appropriate care for the different bodies of service users, such as skills needed to monitor and protect skin integrity, adhere to hygiene and infection control policies, and maintain the dignity of the client. For example, knowing how to undress, shower and dress a frail 90-year-old who has very stiff limbs in a way that's comfortable for her, preserves her dignity and observes her preferences for how she likes this to be done requires skill. Relationship building and high-level communication skills are also used. For example, building trust and ensuring clients' dignity, providing person-centred care and enablement, and supporting different clients who may be experiencing emotional or physical difficulties or dealing with conflict with family members. Where domestic work, meal preparation and shopping is provided, it's rarely just housework, as a lot of people tend to think it is. It requires the capacity to adjust around very diverse clients' needs and preferences, and working with clients who may be very difficult or aggressive or indeed reluctant to eat at all. However, and this point is really important, the exercise of skills takes time. In the Decent Work Good Care project, we found that even in good providers that there's often insufficient time for the practice of skills held. The allocation of adequate time to care is crucial to the optimum use of both existing and acquired skills, knowledge and competencies. I'm now going to turn to some examples of care work that's provided by aged care workers. So in this example, fieldwork notes taken during the shadowing of a personal care assistant in a dementia aged care unit. Most residential aged care have dementia units, where those in the most advanced stages of dementia are typically located. And this excerpt illustrates just one example of a tiny Filipino worker realising the growing agitation of a much larger man, and she's moving to try and de-escalate his distress. So Lena had been helping a group of residents eat their dinner, but she had to stop to address the situation with Alan's distress, and on her return she then had to work at speed to try and catch up. But in doing so, she rushed several residents through their meal, which wasn't a pleasant experience for either them or her. This excerpt is from an interview with a home care worker working with a palliative care client. So she's describing the massage that she provides this woman in palliative care. So apart from the important body work she's performing, the time she's allocated is inadequate. And now there's a process of negotiation to try and get that time increased, which will incur an extra cost out of the home care package allocated to that client. However, until that's sorted, Helen, like so many aged care workers, ends up having to perform some of the care needed on her own time. And this is something you hear incredibly frequently from aged care workers. They're very reluctant to stop work simply because the time allocated to perform a certain task has run out. The one certainty in aged care is that residents and clients die. And this excerpt from field notes at a home care organisation illustrates the toll on workers. While some services expressly forbid workers to attend the funeral of clients, at this organisation, workers who've been the primary carer are allowed to do so, but they typically have to attend their client's funeral on their own time. What is striking in aged care generally, and this has been in all the aged care systems we've had a look at, is the lack of system-wide or organisational-wide formal support or supervisory practice that might support workers through the death of people with whom they've formed close relationships. I'm now going to turn to some key conditions of work, focusing primarily on wages and working time conditions. So in this table here, while obviously the pay rates for home care workers is higher in Australia, in all jurisdictions, entry-level pay rates sit only just above the applicable minimum wage. And these wages are very low given the skills, level of responsibility and judgment required that I've described. In Australia, any increase in wages for home care workers has only been achieved through the flow-on from national minimum wage decisions. To date, there hasn't, although there's currently one on foot, there hasn't been any revaluing of the work of home care. Within the relevant award, there are 3 levels for frontline home care workers, but pay classifications are very rudimentary compressed, and there's just $1.60 per hour difference between the entry level and the top level at level 3. The award not only fails to provide meaningful progression in terms of pay, but the skill classifications linked to the 3 levels also lack any relevant description and specification of the skills actually required in home care jobs, including at different skill levels. And I've already alluded to Victorian local government and the former New South Wales Home Care Service, but both those home care services do have decent skill descriptors and meaningful differences in pay rates between different levels. Despite numerous government inquiries and the Royal Commission establishing the detrimental impact low wages have on the attraction and retention of aged care workers, there has been an historical disregard and lack of accountability by successive federal governments for ensuring decent award rates in a sector for which it is directly responsible. The federal government is effectively the lead employer in aged care, and this works to limit and normalise the low wages in the relevant awards. This disregard also reflects and reinforces a dominant sector logic or narrative that good aged care workers are not overly concerned with low wages and poor working time conditions because they find meaning in their work, which they do. But it's hard to imagine that similar assumptions will be made about government infrastructure spending in relation to workers in the male-dominated defence support industry. I now want to have a look at just some key deficits in working time conditions, and one of the most egregious is the lack of paid working time. So unlike in New Zealand and the UK, there's no employment provision in Australia that requires that home care workers be paid for the time they spend travelling between clients. It's hard to think of any other Australian sector where an inherent requirement of the job, that is, travelling between clients, would remain unremunerated. Another key deficit is the on-demand work organisation that typifies the sector. So casual contracts or permanent part-time contracts with low numbers of guaranteed hours leave workers wanting more hours of work to provide sufficient income on which to live, which creates underemployment. In 2016, 40% of home care workers wanted more hours of work than they currently had, which is reflected in high rates of multiple job holding, which at 16% was 3 times than that for the total workforce at that time. The other big issue is the way that short hours can be fragmented across the day. So the relevant award not only allows casual workers but also permanent part-time workers to be employed on very short hours that can be broken up over the day. This is the time and task-based oriented allocation and charging for care services under the Home Care Packages program has worked to further fragment working time conditions for home care workers, which directly affects the quality and continuity for both clients and their workers, so central to building a care relationship. And the rates of staff turnover are particularly high in this particular program. The award also provides employers with the capacity to flex permanent part-time workers' hours up from and down to their contracted hours at ordinary time rates, which creates considerable employer flexibility without having to pay a casual loading. And this flexibility arguably acts as a disincentive to provide longer minimum part-time hours to home care workers, which is the express preference of many in the sector. In many ways, designing work that creates this unused labour potential is perplexing, as the centre is continually crying out for more workers. Another widespread employer practice in Australian home care, it's not really found elsewhere, is requiring workers to nominate their availability beyond their contracted weekly minimum hours. That is, in order to be guaranteed a certain number of minimum weekly hours, workers have to be available for additional hours to that minimum. So this practice of availability operates as an on-call mechanism, whereby an employee can be called and expected to cover shifts at very short notice. There's no additional payment for this availability, and where worked, these additional hours are paid at ordinary time, not casual rates. How availability works in practice is illustrated in the following excerpt from an interview with the person in charge of rostering at one of the home care sites the Decent Work Good Care team spent time at. So the schedule is really describing what happens when they've got to cover 5 clients because a care worker is called in sick. And so while in theory the award requires mutual agreement to working additional hours, a worker's nominated availability outside their contracted hours, in this case the worker has said that while she normally starts at 8, she has agreed to be available from 7. It's simply assumed that she will be available, and she, in this instance, she gets a call at 6 and being told, sorry, you know, you've now got to visit Nancy at 7 o'clock. So it really provides, this function of availability really provides for just-in-time rostering changes. I'm now going to turn briefly to the migrant aged care workforce for 2 main reasons. As I said, they form a large and growing proportion of the workforce, and providers are increasingly calling for temporary migrants to fill vacancies and to fill what's seen as increased demand in the sector. Migrants migrating expressly to work in what are deemed as low-skilled occupations would normally be excluded under current Australia's migration regulation, and transition from temporary to permanent status is only possible for skilled jobs, those jobs that are classified at ANSCO levels 1 to 3, not for people who are in frontline care positions, which are classified as ANSCO level 4. However, the government has recently extended the Pacific Labour Scheme to so-called low-skilled workers and has very recently brought in 32 workers on temporary visas from the Kiribati to work in aged care in rural and regional Queensland. And this scheme is being expanded and is essentially an employer-sponsored scheme where workers from Pacific Islands will work in rural and regional Australia. So this chart is to really show that while we don't talk or recognise migrant workers much in Australia, that compared to many other countries, we have a far greater proportion in our aged care workforce. And yet the issue of migrant care workers is, as I said, the focus of very little policy or academic attention here, even from the Royal Commission. One reason may be that many migrants working in aged care are permanent residents, unlike in some other countries. And until the tightening of migration regulation in 2009, with a shift to both temporary visas and tightened skill requirements, many of those currently working as frontline aged care workers had arrived as permanent migrants on family, humanitarian, and even skilled visas. However, over time, the countries where migrants now work as aged care workers, the countries where they were born, has shifted dramatically to those from non-English speaking background countries. And while important post-war, the United Kingdom and also New Zealand have declined as the main country of birth of migrant workers, particularly in residential aged care. And over the last 15 years, there's been a rapid increase in the proportion of migrant care workers from India, which you can see reflected for both in residential aged care and home care. And entrants from Nepal have also grown, while entrants from the Philippines have remained pretty constant since around about 2010. The characteristics of recent migrants data, which I'm using here, is a labour force survey, and unfortunately we can only get reliable data at the aggregate care worker level rather than just aged care worker level. But it does provide information on migrant care workers who arrived between 2006 and 2016 and tells us what type of visa they held on arrival and as at 2016. And as you can see here, among workers who arrived during this period, the top 5 countries of origin are India, the Philippines, Nepal, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And together, those 5 countries of birth are around, will account for 2/3 of recent migrants. But as summarised on this chart here, on arrival, almost 2/3 of care workers in this last columns that you can see here were on a temporary visa. However, those from the top 5 countries were far more likely to enter on a temporary visa than those from other countries. The date of arrival also appears connected to the type of visa held on arrival. So in the first period, from 2007 to 2011, we can actually see there's a higher ratio of permanent visas. However, in the second period, we can see that a much greater proportion of people who arrived during that time arrived on temporary visas. And that really reflects, as I said, Australia's increasingly strict migration settings. Now, in many countries, migrant care workers are located in areas of the labour market with poorer conditions than their locally born counterparts. So we decided to see if that was the case in Australia, given we've got the protective factor of mainly permanent migration status among our migrant workforce. And we looked at 2 job quality indicators available in the 2016 National Aged Care Workforce Census and Survey. casual status and underemployment. And the question we asked was, do these groups of workers have poorer quality jobs against those two job quality indicators than their Australian-born counterparts? And what we found was that compared to Australian workers, that home care workers from a non-English speaking background country were the most likely to be casual and underemployed, whereas English speaking background personal care assistants were more likely to be casual, while non-English speaking background personal care assistants were more likely to be underemployed. And when we ran a multivariate analysis and controlled for socio-demographic and employment characteristics, we found that being a non-English speaking background migrant was significantly associated with both casual status and underemployment. Now, because the literature also suggests that time spent in a host country has a mitigating effect on employment disadvantage for migrants, we also had a look at what happens over time. And sorry, I'm whizzing round to the wrong slides. And our analysis supports the general trend of those findings elsewhere, but paradoxically over time we found that casual employment in fact increases for non-English speaking background personal care assistants, while underemployment increases generally for migrant home care workers. We also found that holding a temporary visa increased the likelihood of casual employment for migrant personal care assistants and underemployment for migrant home care workers. While working for a for-profit employer, which has been associated with much poorer working conditions in countries like the UK, for example, was also associated with casual employment and underemployment for non-English speaking background migrants, particularly home care workers. Now, with the growing demand for an increased aged care workforce, it's highly likely we will need to increase migration to meet this demand. However, given our current migration settings, which position aged care workers low skilled, the great risk for workers coming in on a temporary visa to work in aged care, which is reflected in the characteristics of recent migrant data I've just looked at, is what Peter Mayers calls permanent temporariness, along with the additional vulnerability that workers experience when they're sponsored by employers, as in the Pacific Labour Scheme. And indeed, a similar scheme in New Zealand has been identified as creating specific vulnerabilities for care workers who come in through their essential skills visa scheme. So I've spent most of the lecture setting out how the care, employment and migration regimes in Australia intersect and produce poor conditions of work and poor conditions of care. And in particular, I've drawn attention to the lack of recognition of the skills required and used by aged care workers in award skill classifications, and the lack of any meaningful wage increases up the limited skill classifications in awards. But in conclusion, I want to acknowledge that in our Decent Work, Good Care project, we have come across examples of good practices by Australian aged care providers. But these practices, due in the main to the mission and commitment of specific providers, such as providing longer hours of full-time work for home care workers, involving them in the review of care plans for clients, in one case higher pay rates through an enterprise agreement, training on paid time, are unusual in the Australian context and have occurred in fact in spite of, rather than being encouraged by the settings of our current Australian aged care system. Now I want to briefly canvass, extremely briefly canvass one alternative, drawing on the example of New Zealand home care. So in this observation here, this is really an illustration. This comes out of shadowing home care, particularly home care worker across 6 clients. And we found that not only was this occurring in this individual service, but that the systems in New Zealand support the building in of time in home care. And that's through a number of factors. There's close government link with and oversight of service providers. So rather than having a centralised system as we have in Australia, very remote system, you have devolved district health boards. There's 22 in New Zealand. And in the better district health boards have introduced a policy called alliancing, which is where that board works closely with the, in this case, home care providers contracted to provide home care services to a particular geographical area. So, for example, in one district health board where we spent quite a bit of time, there are 4 home care services, 2 are for profit, 2 are non-for-profit. But the alliancing arrangement means that they have to share their data, they have to share clients, and they are able to give direct feedback to the district health board through changes in policies. They also, very interestingly, encourage a much greater use of nursing staff. So in home care services, nursing staff will very readily come out to assist a home care worker where necessary at a client's home. So they're much more responsive services, and they provide a direct line for worker advocacy, as in this case for a client. So in this particular case, Boutry talks to the registered nurse at her service and says, we need an extra time for Sandra because I need to be able to go shopping with her because she's got nothing to eat on the weekends because the Meals on Wheels service doesn't operate on the weekends. We need to make sure she's got enough to eat. And that was very quickly put in place. In New Zealand too, we've got a career structure that came through an equal pay settlement, which also provided for paid travel time, and it provides qualifications tied to the career structure with meaningful wage increases at different levels of that career structure, and providers are funded to support workers gain qualifications. Okay, so some key takeaways. Well, decent work is necessary but not sufficient to produce high quality care. We also need system-wide direct involvement and accountability by the federal government for the quality of care and the decent work conditions that underpin it. And as I've mentioned, we've had in this country some examples of good paying skill classifications and working time conditions in New South Wales, in the former New South Wales Home Care Service run by the state government, and we have similar paying conditions now in a dwindling number of Victorian local governments. But these services are not sustainable because the federal government hasn't adequately funded the cost of quality care. And that's really what we need to provide this system-wide good care. So before I end, I'd like to thank the list of collaborators on the 2 projects which I've drawn. A special shout out for Wendy Taylor, who's managed the very unwieldy Decent Work Good project over 4 years and helped me with these slides. And also many thanks to Adelina Onikas, who assisted greatly with the design of this presentation, far more elegant than my usual PowerPoints. I thought I'd end with this lovely image of a worker and a client in a New Zealand Pacifica home care service we visited, where older adults are treated as elders. We saw this very much in action, also in their connections with local communities, including with different Pacifica community elders who actually don't use the service. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
So thank you very much, Sarah, for an excellent talk. When I listen to it, I mean, the more you listen, you feel heavier. Sometimes it's sad, not able to looking after our aged people better. So now we are into the Q&A sessions. We've got a couple of questions. So here is one for you. So insecure work infects far too many workplaces, and it is particularly perverse in a wealthy country as Australia. In your experience with the Royal Commission, is there a meaningful discussion on the value of awards and enterprise bargaining agreements as key contractual instruments that set the minimum platform for decent work in the aged care and the like sectors? If there are discussions on food, what is the general tenor? If not, do you see any reasons for the silences?
Excellent question. In fact, there have been 20 inquiries into aged care across the last 20 years in Australia, so the Royal Commission was the last one. And this has been the only inquiry that actually recommended a wholesale addressing of wages and skill classifications. Now, it's unclear the extent to which this will be taken up. The federal government says it supports this recommendation in principle. What that means, we don't know. There is currently a work value case being undertaken by the Health Services Union, which is looking at wages only, which is looking at a $5 wage increase for both home care, well, really in home care and residential care. It's not just for frontline workers, it includes also the other workers I haven't spoken about, but the very necessary administrative kitchen staff and cleaning staff that particularly work in residential aged care. Enterprise bargaining has proved quite a disaster in Australia. It's particularly in home care, it's very difficult for unions to organise, and the very few enterprise agreements that exist, the wage increases are either exactly the same as in the award, or they sit literally cents above the applicable award rate. As I said, the one exception, apart from a couple of very good aged care providers and Victorian local government, they are the exceptions to that. Their enterprise agreements provide significant wage increases. So it's very clear that something has to be done, particularly in this sector, and going right back to the beginning quote from the Royal Commission, if you're going to have good quality caring relationships, you need a stable workforce to provide that continuity to enable those care relationships to flourish. And without, with insecure work, and particularly increasing the fragmented way work is organised, that's very difficult to achieve.
Thanks, Sarah. Here's another one. What could the federal government do more to promote careers in aged care and home care, both to those new and experienced in the workforce?
Interestingly, without doing anything about wages or conditions, there are some promotion campaigns. There is some work being done by the relevant Age Workforce Council to say, look, this is a really good sector of work to come into, and that is true. And as I said, if you talk to workers, they really do find they're there, not because of the wages or the conditions, but because they view this as important work. What they do mind, though, is that the community and indeed the government doesn't seem to recognise that in ensuring that they're properly paid. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over time, but it will seriously need to be addressed. And when the government does costing for and there will be an increased cost if we're going to have a quality aged care system, it absolutely needs to factor in decent wages and conditions, and those conditions go to time. So one of the things the Royal Commission has mandated in residential aged care only is they've mandated a certain number of care hours per day per resident, which is going to need an increased number of workers. But why aged care providers don't simply provide workers who are desperate to work longer hours with those hours is, you know, the million-dollar question. It seems quite bizarre that you wouldn't make, as I said, you wouldn't make use of this spare labour capacity that's clearly sitting there. But I think that there's a view, particularly if we're moving to this home care package system, that, and this is true as my colleague Fiona McDonald has written extensively about in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the models actually drive the fragmentation of employment. So we need to be rethinking how can we provide good employment conditions and still respond to the needs of individual clients for the care and support when they need it.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So here's another one. You mentioned the ageism and the genderism. I'm wondering if you have considered the intersection with racism, given your findings regarding the workforce.
Absolutely, and very good question. And that's certainly come out in our in workers we've spoken to, home care workers who attend a client's home and has the door, you know, will have the door slammed shut in their faces we're not having an Asian or we're not having an African come into our house, thank you very much. And because the consumer-directed care system now emphasises choice and control, and so you say to providers, so what do you do? And they say, well, you know, it's kind of up to the client. If they don't want this person, well, can we force them to have this person? So racism is endemic, I have to say, Zing, and in residential aged care, workers who are not visibly Anglo-Celtic have a tough time, not only sometimes from Anglo-Celtic residents, but also from their Anglo-Celtic co-workers.
Okay, thanks, Sara. I sort of have to jump in on this question because as a migrant, you know, you experience this kind of the work environment. So I'm wondering whether culture has ever considered in the, you know, aged care framework, because different culture will see it quite differently, would have different requirement. Has that any kind of a customization, any sort of protocol or regime for taking that consideration into aged care?
Well, look, in Australia, because we are a migrant country, there are quite a few what we would call ethno-specific services. So that, in fact, you know, the unfortunates and Basils, which is the subject now of a coronial inquest because of the appalling handling of COVID, was an ethno-specific facility for Greek-speaking older people. We know as people age, particularly migrants, they often revert back to their mother tongue, and there is the real need for culturally appropriate care. But there's also a need for so-called mainstream services to be providing that. And once again, some of the better services will try and do so, but when services spend so little on food, and I'm thinking of residential aged care, and in some of the better providers we found, you know, $6-7 a day per resident was being spent on food. What you're providing is, it's very hard to make culturally appropriate food. So this is a huge issue, and there are now certainly a lot of policies, and the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia is very big on this and trying to have more done around culturally appropriate care and food. On the reverse side, though, what some migrant care workers will tell you is that they find, because particularly from some cultures, they come where elders are respected, they find the paternalistic way, or the infantilising of aged care service users as quite offensive and foreign to the way in which they see older people. So that, yeah, there are some real tensions.
Okay, thanks. So we're approaching the time. Here's the last one, I hope. How might we begin and encourage value alignment between providers, care workers, and the residents if policy is weak?
Well, excellent question, and this is why we need strong policy. We need, as I said, the government has been missing in action. There's this fantasy that aged care is a market. Now, the Royal Commission interim report clearly said aged care is not a market. It can't operate according to market principles. We need an active, engaged government that actually takes responsibility for this particular domain. And the example I used before of the defence support industry, this is a government, seen as a government responsibility to make sure we have defence capability. It should also be a government responsibility to ensure we have decent care infrastructure, because it is infrastructure, that actually support you know, people in Australia as they age.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. There's another question. In your observations of training for care workers, did you notice any existing formal and informal training in dealing with CALD clients? CALD clients.
Oh, cold clients.
CALD, yes.
Yes, which is that term people use for people who are culturally and linguistically different.
Okay,
I personally don't like it because it the Anglo-Celtic is the norm. There is sometimes some training, and I know that the one of the non-profit organisation in Victoria, the Multicultural Women's Health, does quite a bit of training in residential aged care to try and engender some recognition of culturally appropriate care. It's not there by and large, so the formal care that most workers have done as Certificate 3 or Certificate 4 in aged or community care. Some of them have done specialties in dementia care. When the federal government surveyed providers at the end of last year, it asked them what training it provided, and a number of them said that it provided diversity and inclusion training. What that is, though, we don't quite know. But I think that they're given our ageing migrant populations, particularly our post-war populations, there's a real need to have that training in place.
Okay, I think the time is up. So on behalf of all participants, thank you so much for excellent, this is an enlightening talk. And for the rest of the participants, I wish you have a good afternoon, and looking forward to see you in another lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you for coming.